an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Let me just start by saying thank you. You hit that play button on your podcast app, and here we are. Look at that. It's great of you to include us in your routine. And I'm finding out that routines are apparently more important than habits. There's a subtle distinction. We should get into that one day. This is Now and Next, the flagship podcast for Story Studio Network. I'm Dave Trafford. Just a reminder, next week we are going to have our power panel back. We're trying to figure out what to call it. If you got a thought on it, send me a note. You can find me on the social media at Dave Trafford, Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, Threads. Let me know what you think. Haven't heard it? Go back and listen. It was a fun session. In this episode, we're going to talk about two very important things. Teaching our kids what it means to be an entrepreneur, that failing is okay. And let's dig in on this conversation around food security and food insecurity. What does it actually mean? In the day and age when we need to feed more and more people because there are more and more people coming to this part of the world. And that means we need to build more housing, which effectively means we're chewing up a lot of land, and a lot of it's farmland. Where's that balance? So we'll get into that. But before we do, just a couple of notes. All the hue and cry about the Gardiner Expressway in Toronto and the construction being done. Moves to speed up the construction from a 3-year project to, fast track it because, well, it's just hell trying to get around downtown. Now, what's getting glossed over is the idea that transit workers in Toronto could go on strike. And we haven't had a strike in Toronto at the TTC since it was declared an essential service in 2011. A court quietly, I like to think I'm paying attention, but the court quietly overturned that essential service order. They can now go on strike. If they go on strike in the next 3 to 5 weeks, you think things are fucked now because of the Gardiner problems. Wait until there's no subway. Wait until there are no buses. Wait until there are no streetcars. And then tell me that Doug shouldn't be using the notwithstanding clause and declare the TTC an essential service. Just saying. All right, let's get to the question. Kitchen table issues, right where you live. The whole issue of balancing the need for farmland, the need for housing, and the food on your table. All right, here we go. The headlines are captured by, here in this province, the green belt, etc. And that seems to kind of calm down since the premier backed away from it and said, okay, we made mistakes and all, here's where we're going. But there's still a question around a lot of the farmland in certainly in Ontario that was targeted as a result of the sale of some of that land. There is the whole question of the 413, the highway, and then we're talking about plans to buy the farms in Wilmot, and whether or not it's the province or the feds who are involved in that. The question is, are we giving up good, necessary farmland for the purposes of development? And I realize this is where we are, this is where we live. But at some point, there's a diminishing return. So we thought we should check in with Keith Currie. He is the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. Joins us this morning, and no stranger to getting up early. So this is probably a sleep-in for you, considering we're recording this just before 9 in the morning. How are you?
I'm good, Dave. Thanks.
All of this kind of coming together at the at a sort of a pointy end of the sword, so to speak, around the land use is a real issue, obviously long term, and I just want to get your sense on Where's that line? We need the farmland, there's no question, but we also have to consider an expanding development around particularly the GTA when we talk about so many people coming to the region every year. Where do you draw that line, or how do you give guidance here?
Well, it's a tough balancing act, and everybody has their sides that they're on regarding whether it's this subject or any subject matter. And with respect to land use, the way we have to look at it, at least from an agriculture perspective, is we're not making new land. And when you look at the GTA in particular, it holds the vast majority of number one class land in the country, and class one land is the best production land. Now, we understand when people settled many centuries ago, you settle around water. That's whether it's streams, lakes, rivers, whichever, and then you build it from there. But when especially when we're talking about the Greater Toronto area, that's where the growth is. That's where people come. And so from a political side, whether you're municipal, provincial, or federal governments, you're trying to balance a lot of things. And unfortunately, what governments holistically don't do is look at the big picture long term. They look at a 4-year cycle and what do I need to do, and who do I need to satisfy in that term? Because I've had a lot of supporters, whether it's financial, whether it's helping me get elected, and they also have visions on where they want to go. So now, how do we balance that with what the right decisions are? And when it comes to the land use, we've been fighting this. When I say we, I mean us in agriculture, especially on the political side of agriculture. Been fighting with governments really since the beginning of time on not so much protect every inch, but let's look at responsible growth. We understand that, going forward, even us in agriculture, we're looking across the country, but in the next decade, we're going to be probably over 100,000 jobs short on the farm of employees. So we need people coming to work on our farms, to work in the farm-related businesses, the services that work on our farms. We need those people coming, and so they have to have a place to live. But our governments, in particular municipal and provincial governments, looking at this holistically and looking at, can we infill better? Are we using our spaces better? Are we building up as opposed to out? What does our building footprint look like? But most of the time, what they want to do is take the easy route. And the easy route is, let's just go get more land and start building houses and let's sprawl. And I know that one of our beloved, most favorite mayors of all time from Mississauga, Hazel McCallion, is championed by a lot of people as spending many years as mayor, but she's also known as the Queen of Sprawl. And she loved to build and build and build. And that was great when things were going well and, the economy was churning and we seemed to have an endless supply of food without any issues with respect to labor or supply chains or a war in Ukraine that's changing the game on a lot of things. Various climate issues happening. Now we need to start focusing on a country like Canada and a province in particular like Ontario, which really is about a third of the country's agriculture when it comes right down to it, from production and dollar value. How do we protect that better? And how do we look at it from an economic development standpoint as opposed to just a place to grow our houses? Unfortunately, our governments, our politicians at all levels today don't understand the unbelievable economic booster that agriculture is. So there's just under 1 million people in the province of Ontario alone working in the agri-food industry, and that shocks a lot of people when I tell them that. It's a massive employer. We used to think the province runs on 4 wheels, and the reality is the agriculture industry is about 2.5 times the GDP of the automotive sector. We're about 6 times more in employment. And, we live within a day's drive of 250 million people here in Ontario. So that's tremendous opportunities that we can have for the industry. So how do we protect it and grow it and use it to the benefit of all the people, all the citizens in the province and the country?
And it's important to note that the sort of the backbone of agriculture historically has been the family farm. We've seen, the larger corporations and companies kind of move into some of the regions and into the business. But when we all talk about the green belt, and I'm just curious to get your reaction to this, because there's this sense that we need to protect the green belt at all cost, and I understand the sentiment behind that, but I also know that there were family farms in that area where now what do I do with this, because I'm the last of the group that wants to actually farm the land. My kids don't want to be involved in the business anymore. They've got other things that they're pursuing. And all of a sudden now that you're stuck with a kind of a very difficult choice in terms of what's the future of that land in a greenbelt protected area where, you can't sell it to a developer, and then trying to find, you've already pointed out, capacity within farming is already an issue in terms of work and support. What's that dynamic look like from your perspective?
Well, just before I answer that, Dave, I should mention that still in Canada today, 98% of the farms are family owned and operated. Now, many of them are incorporated, and that's a business decision that they are making, but we still have 98% of our farms in this country that are family owned and operated, and we're pretty proud of that fact. I hear the term, the corporations are coming in, or corporate farming, and I'm not sure that the people that use those terms really understand what they're saying. It's something that they hear, so I just wanted to clarify that just off the top. With respect to the Greenbelt, the concept of the Greenbelt when it came in 2005 wasn't a bad one. The way it was implemented was horrible. There wasn't a very good job of consultation. There were meetings held where you can come out and yell and scream and all that kind of stuff, but nobody within the McGuinty government was really listening to the practical implementation of that concept or that initiative. And really, I think it could have been handled differently. But to your point, our struggle for the farmers within the Greenbelt are the rest of the world is building up around them. What happened initially in the beginning was a lot of leapfrogging. So the developers that couldn't build within the Greenbelt were jumping over the line, just outside the line, and starting to develop. And really, if they wanted to make a Greenbelt, they should have gone way farther than they did as far as area to really try and prevent that leapfrogging, especially in Simcoe, Brant counties in particular, around those areas. Even as far as Kitchener, Waterloo would have made a lot more sense to prevent that leapfrogging effect. But because they didn't, now that growth has happened, and what's really happened is these farmers are now in a silo. They're surrounded by development. Yes, that land is saved in perpetuity for agriculture, but if you can't function within that area, getting crop input supplies, fertilizer, seeds, crop protection products, getting that in, getting the services you need to run your business, whether it's mechanics or people that come on your farm and do soil testing and all that kind of stuff. If those services move away because there's just not enough business there for them to really survive as a business themselves, they move away. So it makes it much more difficult to farm. And if it gets to the point where you can't get access to the services that you need to farm, then what do you do? How do you function? And you want to get out, but your land's not worth anything. You can't sell it to anybody for development. Nobody's going to buy it unless somebody wants it as a 100-acre estate lot to build a one big mansion on it. So the thought process wasn't really dealt with properly in the initial beginning of the implementation of the Greenbelt. And I get the concept of trying to preserve the land, but they really went about it wrong. And even as you fast forward into what happened with the Premier here last fall, I think there's a lack of understanding by current politicians on the Greenbelt as well, because the reality is the way the Greenbelt was designed. Because I sat on the Greenbelt Review Committee back in 2015, and at that time, and although it's pushing almost 10 years now, at that time the developing world told us that there was at least 25 to 30 years of development still available within the Greenbelt itself. So let's say we still have 15 years left of available land. Depending on the pace of growth, we still have 15 years of growth within the Greenbelt before that allowable land is full. Now, yes, there's some developers may be out of land, and those are the ones that are pushing for expansion because they don't have any land to build on. But the Greenbelt was also designed with a white belt. And the white belt is always intended to be the spillover. Once the Greenbelt area was full, then we would move into the white belt area, which is, for simplistic terms, essentially, if you take the 407 where it runs, that's kind of a band of where the white belt is, where the growth, once the green belt lands are full, jumps into the white belt area. So there was measures there in place to continue growth if needed, going forward into the green belt. But it was about trying to get responsible growth, because once they put that in place, it meant people had to start. Municipalities had to start infilling. They couldn't just sprawl to build. They had to start infilling. They had to reclaim lands. They had to look at brownfields. They had to look at areas where they could still build while still protecting urban river valleys and open spaces, et cetera, et cetera. So, as I say, the concept was good. Just the implementation wasn't maybe as good as it could have been in the beginning.
I talked to Neil Hetherington at Daily Bread Food Bank last week. 330,000 visits a month, to the food bank. So it really puts a punctuation point on food security. And so much of that obviously happens literally in your backyard in terms of how it's addressed. And they're all related. Housing, food security, poverty. There's a thread that we can draw through all of those things that if we're not paying attention to it, there's a tipping point where we can't return from it.
We have a lot of environmental groups that are, of course, trying to protect the green belt, and their go-to line is, we have to save the farmland. And so my question to that is, what are you saving the farmland for? Because if you can't save the farmer, it doesn't matter if you save the farmland. And so when it comes to subjects like food security, our issue in Canada is not about food availability. We can produce the food. It's about affordability. And when you factor in the last few years of inflation and interest rates rising, and really what it comes down to is disposable income isn't the same as it used to be. The simple reality of the matter is that people in Canada the average Canadian pays about 11%, spends about 11% of their income annually on food. So when you think about that number, it's not very high. But as I mentioned, we're squeezed even more by interest rates in particular, especially on mortgages. That becomes tough, and jobs, people aren't working the same as they used to. So that factors into being able to afford food. And yes, food prices have gone up. All of our costs have gone up, so that squeezes people. But it comes back to, understanding why you want to save farmland in particular. And that is when really you need to be saving the farmer. And when I say the farmer, I don't just mean the people that I represent. I mean the industry as a whole. And we haven't had a reason to not worry about food being on the shelves, really. I mean, COVID was a bit of a blip, as I mentioned, but really we haven't had a reason as a society to worry about food not being there. So the priority to really save it isn't high on most politicians' lists, because it's always been there, and there's an assumption that it always will be there, because we are really blessed in Canada and in Ontario in particular with tremendous natural capital assets, with climate, soils, etc., and a market. So somehow we have to, as I said earlier, I think, change the mindset to an economic prosperity aspect to get people to buy into why agriculture is important, why the industry itself, and not just farming. And it all starts at the farm. But if I don't have a place to send my stuff, then what am I supposed to do? So I think if people just understood the general concept, they don't need the details, but just the concept of how important the agri-food industry is in this country, even to their own well-being, I think we'd be miles ahead.
You're literally talking about kitchen table issues here. And while there's the bigger picture, the trade implications, the economic implication, I read this week, the food land is not going to reopen in Colborne because the head office has decided that it doesn't economically make sense for them to do business there. My head spins when I hear that. Somehow you think that people wouldn't be wanting to go to the grocery store to buy the food that you guys are producing, et cetera. So that really, even that idea of it being accessible and affordable, that throws a wrench into it right away. If a large company has looked at it and said, it's not economically viable. It doesn't make sense for us to be in the food business in this particular community.
Yeah, and all companies are looking at their bottom lines and does that particular store make sense for us economically? And I do the same thing on my own farm. If there's a certain aspect, a certain sector or aspect of my business that I'm I'm doing that doesn't make economic sense, I'm taking a long hard look at whether I want to continue growing that particular crop or renting that particular farm because the production is terrible on that farm or whatever the circumstances may be. So I think to a certain extent we need to respect those businesses and their decisions that they're making for the right reasons, as long as they're making them for the right reasons, and not just about solely profit. Although I mean we're all in this to make money. Nobody's in a business of any kind to lose money. So we have to understand that there's just an expectation that we will have, in particular, food available to us wherever we need it. And so I think that's where people struggle. I think, the inconvenience now that you have of not being able to go to that food land is probably what bothers you the most. And I think, when we look at say the federal government in particular in this case, when they take a look at it holistically, their entire mandate since they got elected has all been intertwined with a climate change mandate. So how is this climate change mandate going to change now that you have to drive an extra half an hour or more to a different food store, right? Yes, they might get a bit more money out of you for carbon tax in your fuel, but long term, are you putting more emissions in the air? Is your municipality's road infrastructure going to suffer more because people are driving farther in the long term? How all those kinds of factors that go hand in hand might warrant a different discussion around governments on how we interact with these businesses to try and at least create the atmosphere or the environment where I'm going to stay. I can see the long term. Today might look rough, but I see something I see the sun rising on the horizon on this business, so I'm going to stay there and I'm going to wait it out. And that's the kind of thing that governments don't always look at. They're so short visioned. They're not looking at a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan. And in the case of climate change, it needs to be almost a century plan to get this to work. They don't look in those terms of time. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have that long-term picture. Yeah,
the only long-term thinkers that I know are municipal planners who actually their calendar pushes out 40 years. But to your point, it's hard to jam that 40-year vision into a 4-year mandate at any level of government. But, that's at the heart of some of the places where we have these, food deserts, is the legislature hasn't followed the good guidance of the planners who said this is how you avoid a food desert. And we've created one in for all intents and purposes in Colborne in this case. So those planning issues, as boring as they may sound, become critical in this kind of long-term view of how do we manage this.
Well, I mean, it's a struggle for planners. I mean, I don't want to throw planners under the bus because we do work with planning associations right across the country because it's important that we do. But many of them are very cookie cutter, and that's partly to do with the education process. But we used to talk in terms of we want to live where we work and where we play. But when you think about that, soon as you move into an area where you can both play and work, now you're complaining because there's trucks driving in and out of the factories that are the place that employ you. And my kids are going to the park, but I don't want to cross the street because I got all this traffic. And so how do we change that type of planning where we can still achieve that, work close to home, still have the play areas close to home, but feel safe and secure and happy in our neighborhoods that we're living. And I think that's why you've seen a mass exodus to the suburbs for a lot of people. Part of that's affordability, but part of that's a little more peace and quiet from the aspect of hustle and bustle of trucks and that kind of stuff, factories, whatever the case may be. But these are also important places of employment. So how do we take a holistic, bigger picture view of planning long term? I used to talk when I was with the Ontario Federation of Agriculture about focusing on on work areas along major highways like the 400 series. To me, that made a lot more sense. If we have to give up land for warehousing and places of employment, you're right close to highway arteries where trucks are on anyways. They can get in and out easily. You're not interfering with a lot of areas, and to me that just made a lot more sense. But people don't always want to listen to what I have to say, so there you go.
Keith, it's always good to talk to you, and good luck with the work you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate you letting me on the program, Dave. I always enjoy these conversations.
A lot of talk lately about the state of just our economy, our economic position and place in the world here in Canada. And if you start to look at some of the commentary, it comes down to watching us slip from, being in the top 5, maybe even the top 3 30 years ago in terms of productivity and that economic leadership and clout we had. And now we're kind of dropping down into the high teens, maybe depending on who's counting, the low 20s. And it has a whole lot to do with how we look at innovation, how we look at productivity. And of course, all of this really caught fire lately, the conversation, because Ottawa's move around the capital gains tax and redefining what all of that means. And the understanding was, interestingly enough, as we're going to get into this conversation, the whole point was to support and promote the younger generation here in Canada, to make sure that they had what we have as an older generation. The irony in all of that is all I hear from the investment community is that you are stunting investment, you're stunting innovation. So what will we have for this next generation except more debt, et cetera? So against that backdrop, I was excited to see in my LinkedIn feed this week an announcement. You always get these got personal news or highlights. Rocco Rossi starting a new position as president and CEO at Shift 25. So a couple of reasons. Had the opportunity. Well, Rocco and I have been talking for a long time over the years in terms of his various roles and my singular sitting in this seat, as it may be, just watching the world go by. But, when you were running for mayor in this city, when you were running the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, most recently, I was watching what you were doing, and you were off on, your literal journeys, walking journeys, and was fascinated to kind of get your read on where we all are. And now I see you pop up with Shift 25, and I'll let you kind of explain it, but it really caught my attention because it's all about innovation. It's all about inspiring and motivating a new generation of thinking. And I say that broadly and very specifically. And that kind of excites me, considering, what we're looking at, the challenges we're looking at. But I love it because it's about opportunity, Rocco.
Well, it's exactly what has drawn me to it as well, Dave. I share that sentiment. Look, several years ago, Canada moved forward with a very ambitious goal of owning the podium when it came to our performance at the Olympic Games. And that's an incredible campaign to help with national pride, certainly to help the sports community. But this is absolutely more fundamental, because at the end of the day, it's not a business issue. It is a societal issue, because owning the podium when it comes to innovation, when it comes to productivity, when it comes to competitiveness, it is not just about what businesses are doing. It's our ability to take care of our people as we age. It's our ability to invest more in schools. It's our ability to build affordable housing. So, we just came out of a budget that the central theme was fairness, and who can argue against fairness? That's a really important thing. But what our group is really fundamentally interested in is, how do we grow so that we have the resources to be increasingly more fair each and every year going forward? And to your point, how do we, as Canadians who have have benefited through our generation of the wonderful promise and potential of Canada. How do we ensure that the next generation and the generations after that have a better and not a worse Canada to deal with?
I remember, and we will all remember, if we were of an age, when we lived through the financial crisis of 2009. And the phrase that kept coming back was not, that we were going to have to tweak or make adjustments. We were going to have to recalibrate. And to me, that was an important word. And if we thought it was important in 2009 or 2010, in 2024, recalibrate is the least we have to do, especially coming out of COVID. And what you're talking about here is this whole notion of creating it's a foundational culture, if nothing else, that gets away from this idea that, you go to school, you get a good job, and you have your career and you carry on. I love that when I go to the website and look at Shift 25 and it talks about, we're going to celebrate failure. I mean, you don't use those words, but you're almost encouraging that as an experience to be able to say, oh, well, shit, that didn't work, but I learned from it. And there's something valuable in that.
Absolutely. And it's why one of the first concrete programs that Shift 25 has put out there is we're now in over 4,000 classrooms across the country, over 100,000 students and growing, a curriculum, a unit to add into the high school curriculum around exactly reframing the notion of failure. Failure should not be seen as a source of shame. It should be embraced as an opportunity to learn and to grow. That's what resilience is all about. That's what entrepreneurship is all about. That's what innovation is all about. I mean, Thomas Edison famously said after 1,001 experiments on the electric light bulb that failed because the material he was using would burn up, would not be sustainable. And he was said, well, that's 1,001 failures. And he said, no, that was 1,001 lessons about what doesn't work that pushed me towards what does work. And that's the kind of culture that Shift 25 is hoping to nurture, to celebrate, because that's at the heart of innovation and building a more prosperous Canada.
Okay, there's a lot of details in that can, so I want to pick it one at a time here. Let's first start with the whole idea that this is an initiative. I think it started, if I saw correctly, in the UK. Is that where it started?
No, there is another group with a similar name, but that's a different. This is started by a group of leaders right here in Canada, many of whom are either immigrants themselves or children of immigrants, as virtually all of us are. And really, what we want to do is, there are lots of groups that are going to do specific policy discussions around the capital gains tax or around this or that regulation. That's not what Shift 25 has been created to do. This is really more audacious, if you will, because it's looking at altering or shifting, if you will, the national culture around things like innovation, around things like entrepreneurship, around things like how we frame failure, and really to create the conditions and the societal support so that when policy decisions are made, they're done within a framework that says, no, we want a Canada that is more ambitious. We want a Canada that supports more innovation, not less innovation. We are a Canada that celebrates entrepreneurship. And so there should be a growth lens, an innovation lens in every decision that we make at a political level.
So here's the challenge, and you will already know this because you're in the middle of it, but let's just flesh it out a little bit. Because you're talking about 21st century thinking in terms of need and looking forward into the 22nd century, because that's really where it's all going to play out. Let's face it, this is a long-term project. And you're trying to do that against the backdrop of institutions that are still in the 19th century. and that's government and education. I mean, for the most part, right? And I say that with all due respect.
Yeah.
Because they're just slow to turn around. And the use of the phrase failure in school takes on a completely different thing than failure in business, too. And the idea that now we've got to this point where, you know, we don't give kids marks anymore. We give them, notes on or do we even do all that kind of stuff? So baked into that culture is already a response that's reflexive. That people are going to say, oh, geez, this is just another bullshit thing where we're not going to make kids accountable for what they're doing. If failure isn't something, then how do we deal with it? So against that backdrop, I can see how you've already got, you know, an uphill battle in terms of changing minds, like the old guys like me who are going to criticize this.
Look we're not saying that failure is something you dismiss, to be absolutely clear. And one of the things we object to is papering it over, but is embracing it and saying, okay, this didn't work. What do we learn from it? How do we get better? If it becomes a motivator to change behavior and to grow, then fine. If it's that, oh, there is no such thing as failure, just do your best and that's okay, that is definitely not what we're saying. So there is an action required in terms of recognizing the failure and then embracing it and saying, what do I learn from it? How do I grow from it? Not, oh, it's okay to fail and just keep on keeping on with no effort to change behavior based on what has gone wrong.
Yeah, a lot of the conversations that we've had in various shows that we've done, of course, whether it's the Canada Disability Benefit, any of those sorts of things. I do a lot of work with the Daily Bread Food Bank, and we talk a lot.
I really appreciate that.
Well, it's important, and you know as well as I do. But we hear a lot about the phrase of lived experience, and I think that's an important, both. This is lived experience, and that is at the heart of resilience. That is at the heart of learning, and it's a really good example in terms of where government failed to deal with lived experience at the Canada Disability Benefit level. They screwed that up from the word go. As soon as they made the promise they couldn't keep, that was a problem. But again, that goes back to my issue around government. Don't worry, I'm the government, I'm here to help. It just kind of gets in its own way. But I love the idea of incorporating entrepreneurial skills into a curriculum. And most people will look at me, and the answer I've had back when I've said, we need to do this, they'll say, well, not everybody's cut out to own or run their own business. You could work for the government of Ontario in a public service job and have an entrepreneurial spirit about what you do, and it gets at the heart to say, okay, I've got a team here. How are we going to figure this out? We might fail, but we might, in fact, learn from it. And at the end of the week, we're going to be better for it.
100%. You should be the one leading this organization, Dave, because you've hit the nail right on the head. This is not just about the creation of more businesses. It is an innovation mindset. It is an entrepreneurial mindset in everything that we do. So it's in, and I've always disliked the term the not-for-profit sector. I really consider it the for-impact sector. But there's innovation in that sector each and every day. There's innovation possible in government. You said earlier, government's not really, we're still in the 19th century. In some respects, absolutely. Where we see the opportunity is, for good or ill, we lived through a horrendous experience of COVID-19 for several years. And during that time, and by no means did we get it all right, but what we were prepared to do, because we had to, was to act quickly and then to iterate policy based on what the lived experience on the ground was. And what we want to do is take this moment when we've had this experience of A, collaboration across all levels of government, all parties, and B, a emphasis or a default to speed, to use that time to accelerate what we're doing around the innovation agenda, because guess what? The rest of the world is doing that. And the Financial Times recently had an article talking about breakdown nations that had been doing so well for so long, and now in the last several years, seemingly in decline. And Canada is topping that list, which actually is a head scratcher for most of the rest of the world, because they look at us with envy about all of the advantages that we have, and seemingly we're getting in our own way.
You know, and I think too often we start to talk about innovation as something that is shiny, new, space-driven, kind of, wow, next generation. And what I've learned lately, because we were doing a work with the Forest Product Association, and they want to talk about innovation in forestry. And what I learned is that, you know, trees have been around forever. So I'm not quite sure how we move that thinking forward with that frame of innovation. What I learned is innovation is more about a new way of thinking about an old problem. And we want, again, I go back to government. It sounds like I'm picking on them. We want to talk about innovation like we're reinventing the world, as opposed to just bringing a different lens to an old problem. And what is the problem we're trying to solve? We don't often ask that question often enough.
You're absolutely right, Dave. This is not an initiative that's about how do we create the next Google in Canada, or the next Shopify, the next unicorn, as they're called. It is about how do we take what's almost a $3 trillion legacy economy and juice it up, because that's where the enormous leverage is, not creating another $1 billion company. It's taking $3 trillion and goosing it up to its full potential. And I'll give you just one simple measure on that front. It's a proxy for thinking about this. But here, Ontario, the economic engine of Canada, we generate as an economy roughly $60,000 in GDP each and every year for every man, woman, and child in Ontario. And relative to many other provinces, including, say, Quebec, which is at 54,000, we're doing quite well. But you compare us to the 8 U.S. states that border the Great Lakes and that are our main customers and main partners for many things, from New York to Minnesota, the average GDP per capita in those 8 states is $20,000 more every year for every man, woman, and child. So translate that into Ontario with 15 to 16 million people. $20,000 each and every year is another $300 to $320 billion. Think about how much more fairness would be possible with an extra $320 billion. What could Neil Hetherington and the folks at the Daily Bread Food Bank do with a fraction of that? And yet that's being left on the table just to get to average. And the last time I checked, we're not a society that wants to content itself with being average. We want to own the podium. And we have millions of people from around the world lining up each and every year wanting to get here because of the enormous potential of Canada.
Well, with that kind of investment, Neil would happily go out of business. Right? I mean,
100%.
And you know, we might be getting off topic, but your point around productivity is at the heart of this entire conundrum that we're facing. And I go back to the Canada Disability Benefit. I go back to ODSP here in Ontario. The cost of poverty in Ontario, and I say this all the time, pre-COVID was $33 billion. Across the country, $80 billion. I can't imagine what it is now when we're talking about 330,000 visits to the food bank in a month. And I know this just may not sound like it's related to what you're talking about, but it's at the heart of what you're talking about.
100%. We cannot afford as a society, either economically or morally, to leave anyone behind. And I don't want to have a discussion just around what should the minimum wage be. I want a discussion around how do we create an economy where there are as few minimum wage jobs as possible, because we are generating value added, because we are investing in people, in material, in machinery, in software, to be at the cutting edge, from forestry to mining to IT, because everything has an opportunity for innovation, from government to the impact sector to industry. This isn't just about business. This is about Canada writ large.
Shift 25, and Rocco Rossi is the inaugural president and CEO. It's always good to talk to you. Glad we had the chance to catch up. Thank you so much for shining a light on this, and keep doing the great work that you're doing, my friend. Well, that was fun, wasn't it? Yeah, Rocco Rossi's a great guy, and it's always good to catch up with him and talk to him about the importance of innovation and entrepreneurial spirit. Brings a lot to the table. And, of course, our conversation with Keith Currie. He is the president of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture. I will leave links in the show notes for you. So if you want more information or you've got a comment, as always, feel free to catch up to me on social media at Dave Trafford, and that will find me on Facebook, on Instagram, on Threads, on X, Twitter. I don't know why we keep saying formerly Twitter. We all know what it is now. And on LinkedIn. Okay? Very good. And again, just a reminder, next week we're back to our panel of comms experts. And there's no shortage of shit to talk about, so we're going to dig in on that. And if you haven't heard the panel already, go back. Last week's show was our inaugural session. We're looking for a name for the panel. So if you've got a suggestion, by all means, leave it with us, will you? And you can, again, DM me, find me on social, and let me know what you think. All right, that'll do it for now. And next, it's the flagship podcast for Story Studio Network.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Now and next is Story Studio Network's flagship podcast, produced by our chief executive producer, Dave Trafford, and supported by our entire SSN team, including our senior producers, Becky Coles and Jen Hudson, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler. Jamie Nickerson is our production manager, and our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Also, I'm Erin Trafford, Queen of the Universe.
And that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, everybody, that's a wrap.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.